In the autumn of 2014, 24-year-old Ethan Hayes, a photographer with an affinity for the archaic patience of analog film, drove his worn-out station wagon into the hazy blue heart of the Appalachian Mountains. He was chasing the fleeting spectacle of fall, a blaze of color he intended to capture on celluloid, a medium as temporal and fragile as the season itself. He planned a 4-day solo trek through a remote section of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a place where the trails grew faint and the silence was a physical presence. He was never seen again. The initial search found his carefully made campsite and his backpack, but Ethan and his vintage camera had vanished. Before we uncover what was found more than a decade later, and the mystery that's haunted investigators ever since, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and leave a like. It helps keep stories like Ethan's alive and ensures the ones lost to time are never forgotten. For 11 years, the mountains kept their secret. Then, in the summer of 2025, a geological survey team working far from any marked path found a weathered, algae-slicked canister lodged between the roots of an ancient hemlock. Inside, perfectly preserved, was a single roll of film. When the images were finally developed, they revealed more than just the ghost of a long-lost autumn. The final frame held a secret so dark, it threatened to swallow the light of the 11 years that had passed, proving that Ethan Hayes had not simply been lost to the wilderness, he had been taken by it. The air on the morning of October 12, 2014, was crisp and carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a perfume Ethan Hayes had come to associate with his own sense of purpose. He stood at the trailhead, a map spread across the hood of his car, its creases worn like the lines on a familiar hand. He was a methodical young man, a trait reflected in his art and his preparations. His camera, a heavy mechanical Leica M3, was his inheritance and his instrument, a purely analog device that forced a deliberate pace upon the world. He believed that film, with its grain and its slow dance with light, captured not just an image, but the soul of a moment. He had packed 36 rolls of Kodak Ektar, enough for an army of moments. A park ranger making his morning rounds recalled seeing him there, a lanky figure in a faded flannel shirt, his face etched with a quiet intensity. The ranger, a man named Henderson with 30 years of service in these mountains, noted that Hayes seemed more prepared than the average tourist. His pack was well worn, his boots were properly broken in, and his knowledge of the proposed route was impressive. Ethan pointed to a series of secondary trails on his map, a challenging loop that would take him deep into a sector of the park known for its unforgiving terrain and its profound isolation. The colors should be peaking up there, Ethan had told him, his voice calm and confident. Henderson later reported that the young man's final words to him were, "The light waits for no one." It was a phrase that would take on a chilling resonance in the years to come. Ethan's plan was to be out of contact for 4 days, emerging on the evening of the 16th at a different trailhead 10 miles to the north. His older brother, Leo, a pragmatic software engineer from the city, had the details of the route and the schedule. It was a ritual between them, a concession to Leo's persistent anxiety about Ethan's solitary passions. For the first 4 days, Leo felt a familiar, low-level hum of worry, the kind he had grown accustomed to. But when the evening of the 16th came and went with no call, the hum grew into a roar. By the next morning, there was still no word. Leo called the park authorities, his voice tight with a fear he was trying to suppress with logic and procedure. The official search began within hours. The mountains, which had appeared so majestic and inviting in Ethan's photographs, now seemed menacing, a vast and indifferent wilderness. Henderson, the ranger who had spoken with Ethan, led the initial ground team. They found his station wagon exactly where he had left it, a thin layer of morning dew coating its windshield. The silence of the parking lot felt heavy, expectant. The search teams fanned out, their brightly colored jackets stark against the muted tones of the forest. For 2 days, they followed Ethan's intended route. The trail was difficult, a steep and rocky path that wound its way through dense rhododendron thickets and across fast-flowing streams. They called his name until their throats were raw, the sound swallowed by the immense acoustic deadness of the woods. On the 3rd day, a helicopter spotted something from the air, a small clearing not far from the main trail. It was Ethan's campsite. The scene was unnervingly serene. His tent was neatly pitched, the rainfly taut. Inside, his sleeping bag was rolled up, and a book lay open on top of it. A small camp stove and a half-empty fuel canister sat beside a meticulously built fire pit, cold and dark. His backpack was leaning against a log. A quick inventory confirmed the strangeness of the situation. His food supplies for the remaining journey were there. His wallet, with cash and identification, was tucked into a side pocket. His spare clothes, his water filter, his headlamp, all present. But Ethan was gone, and his Leica camera, the one object he valued above all else, was also missing. The search dogs were brought in, their handlers letting them scent a shirt from Ethan's car. The dogs picked up a trail easily, leading away from the campsite. But after following it for less than a quarter of a mile, they reached a wide, shallow creek. On the other side, the scent simply vanished. The dogs grew confused, whining and circling, unable to find a single trace. It was as if Ethan Hayes had stepped into the running water and been lifted out of the world. The search continued for another week, a period of relentless effort and diminishing hope. Volunteers from nearby towns joined the rangers, their faces grim as they combed the dense undergrowth. Divers searched the deep pools of the creek. Climbers rappelled down steep cliff faces. The weather turned, and a cold, persistent rain began to fall, washing away any potential tracks and chilling the searchers to the bone. The mountains seemed to be actively working against them, pulling a gray shroud of fog and drizzle over their secrets. The official reports from those days are a litany of frustration. No tracks found. No discarded equipment. Area extensively searched with negative results. For Leo Hayes, who had flown in and established a vigil at the park's headquarters, each report was a blow. He stared at the topographic maps tacked to the walls, the search grids drawn in red marker, and felt a growing sense of despair. The Ethan he knew, the meticulous planner, the experienced outdoorsman, would not have simply wandered off. He would not have left his gear. The official theory began to solidify around a tragic but common narrative, a fatal accident. Perhaps he had slipped and fallen into a crevice, or been swept away by a sudden current in the creek. An encounter with a black bear was also considered, though there were no signs of a struggle at the campsite. As the days turned into weeks, the large-scale operation was gradually wound down. The volunteers went home, the helicopters were grounded, and the case was handed over to a single detective to manage as a long-term missing person file. The official status was changed to presumed deceased. For the world, the story of Ethan Hayes was over. Another sad tale of a lone hiker claimed by the unforgiving beauty of the wilderness. But for Leo, it was the beginning of an 11-year war against silence. He refused to accept the official conclusion. The scene at the campsite, so orderly and deliberate, did not speak of an accident. It felt like an interruption, a sentence cut off mid-thought. The missing camera, in particular, haunted him. Ethan would have sooner left his own hand behind. Leo believed that the camera was the key, that whatever had happened to his brother was inextricably linked to the last images he had tried to capture. The mountains remained silent, but Leo was convinced that somewhere, in the light-sensitive emulsion of a lost roll of film, the truth was waiting. The years that followed Ethan's disappearance were a slow grind of grief and obsession for Leo Hayes. He returned to his life as a software engineer, but it was a hollow existence. The logical, ordered world of code and algorithms stood in stark contrast to the chaotic, unanswered question that now defined him. He sold his apartment in the city and bought a small cabin an hour's drive from the national park, a base of operations for a search that never officially ended. His weekends were no longer his own. They belonged to the mountains. He spent thousands of hours hiking the same trails the searchers had covered, and countless more exploring the wild, unmapped terrain that branched off from them. He became a familiar, if somewhat eccentric, figure to the park rangers and the locals in the small gateway towns. He was the brother, the man who couldn't let go. He learned to read the landscape, to understand the subtle language of bent branches and disturbed soil. He spoke to old hunters and retired loggers, men who knew the deep woods in a way that no official map ever could. They told him stories of hidden hollows, of old moonshine stills left to rot, and of people who had gone into the mountains to escape the world and had never come back. He documented every conversation, every rumor, creating a vast personal archive of the park's secret history, hoping to find a single thread that might lead back to his brother. He created a website, a digital memorial, and a clearinghouse for information. It featured Ethan's photography, his hauntingly beautiful landscapes filled with mist and shadow. There was a timeline of the disappearance, copies of the official reports, and a comment section that became a gathering place for amateur sleuths, conspiracy theorists, and genuinely concerned strangers. Leo moderated it all, sifting through an endless stream of tips and theories, most of them useless. But he checked everyone. He followed up on claims of a hermit living in a remote cave, and spent a week searching an area where someone claimed to have found a tattered piece of flannel that matched the shirt Ethan was wearing. The flannel turned out to be from a discarded scarecrow. The hermit was a myth. Each dead end was another small death, another layer of frustration hardening into a grim resolve. His relationship with the authorities soured over time. What began as a partnership devolved into a one-sided campaign of pestering. He called the detective assigned to the case every month, then every few months, presenting his latest findings or theories. The detective, a man nearing retirement, was sympathetic but firm. Without new physical evidence, the case would remain cold. Leo's insistence that the missing camera was the key was noted, but ultimately dismissed as the grasping of a grieving family member. To them, the camera was just another lost object, likely lying at the bottom of a ravine, its film long since destroyed by the elements. The emotional toll was immense. Leo's marriage crumbled under the weight of his obsession. His wife had tried to be supportive, but she could not compete with the ghost that lived in their house, that sat with them at dinner, that dictated their every weekend. "You're searching for a memory," she told him before she left, "but you're sacrificing your whole life to it." He knew she was right, but he was powerless to stop. His search was no longer just about finding Ethan. It was about honoring him. To give up would be to accept that his brother's meticulously lived life had ended in a random, meaningless accident. It would be the ultimate betrayal. He found a strange comfort in the mountains that had taken his brother. He learned their moods, the way the fog settled in the valleys in the morning, the sound of the wind through the pines at dusk. He often took his own camera, a digital one, but he rarely took pictures. He was there to see, not to capture. He felt closest to Ethan in those woods, as if he were walking in his brother's footsteps, seeing the world through his eyes. But there was always a sense of being watched, a feeling that the silence was not empty but attentive. On the 10th anniversary of Ethan's disappearance, Leo made a solitary hike to the abandoned campsite. He sat on the same log where Ethan's backpack had been found and looked out at the creek where the trail had gone cold. The woods were quiet, dressed in the same fiery colors that had drawn his brother here a decade earlier. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. He was older, wearier, a man hollowed out by a single unanswerable question. He had found nothing. The mountains had offered no clues, no solace, only a profound and enduring silence. He was beginning to fear that the detective had been right, that he was chasing a ghost, and that the truth, like his brother, was gone forever. He didn't know that less than a year later, a team of scientists with ground-penetrating radar would venture into a part of the forest he had never reached and make a discovery that would shatter a decade of silence. In July of 2025, a team from the State University's Geology Department was conducting a research project in a remote, protected watershed deep within the park. Their work involved mapping bedrock formations, and it took them miles off any established trail into a primordial landscape of moss-covered boulders and ancient, towering trees. It was an area so inaccessible that it was unlikely a human foot had trod there in decades. One afternoon, while setting up their equipment near the base of a steep, wooded hillside, a graduate student named Chloe noticed something wedged in the gnarled root system of a massive hemlock tree. It was a small, cylindrical object, its metal surface pitted and dark with age and encrusted with mud and lichen. It looked like a piece of old camping gear, perhaps a small fuel bottle discarded long ago. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but a flicker of curiosity made her pry it loose. The object was surprisingly heavy. As she scraped away the grime, she saw that it was a screw-top canister, the kind designed to be waterproof. With some effort, she managed to twist the cap. It came loose with a faint hiss, the sound of air trapped for a very long time. Inside, nestled in the darkness, was a roll of 35mm film. The canister had done its job. The film was dry and appeared to be perfectly preserved. The team, aware of the park's strict leave no trace policy, knew they had to turn it in. They also recognized the potential significance of the find. Film, especially old film, could be a time capsule. Back at the park's headquarters, the canister caused a small stir. The rangers who logged it in knew it was an unusual find. The location where it was discovered was the most puzzling part. It was nearly 15 miles from the nearest trail, in a direction that bore no relation to Ethan Hayes' planned route. The canister was sent to the county sheriff's department, where it landed on the desk of Detective Isabella Rossi. Rossi was a cold case specialist, a sharp, patient investigator who had joined the department long after Ethan's disappearance. She was unfamiliar with the details, so she pulled the file. It was thick with the dust of inaction, filled with old maps, faded witness statements, and the resigned conclusions of the original investigators. As she read through the story of the missing photographer and his lost camera, she felt a jolt of professional excitement. It was a long shot, a 1 in a million chance, but it was the first new lead in over a decade. The department didn't have the facilities to develop old or potentially damaged film, so Rossi sent the role to a specialized forensic imaging lab in another state. The process would be delicate. The technicians knew that the emulsion could be brittle, and they had to handle it with extreme care. Leo Hayes received a call from Detective Rossi a week after the canister was found. She was cautious, managing his expectations. She explained what had been discovered and where, emphasizing that it was impossible to know if it was connected to Ethan's case. But for Leo, after 11 years of silence, the mere possibility was a seismic event. He felt a surge of adrenaline and a terrifying, unfamiliar emotion, hope. He drove to the sheriff's department and met Rossi for the first time. She showed him a photograph of the canister. He didn't recognize it specifically, but he knew Ethan had owned several just like it. He used them to protect his exposed film from the elements. He felt a certainty in his gut that was so powerful it almost made him dizzy. "That's his," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That's Ethan's film." The wait for the results from the lab was agonizing. For 2 weeks, Leo could barely eat or sleep. He paced his small cabin, rereading his old notes, going over the maps again, his mind racing with possibilities. What had Ethan seen in those last moments? What images had he deemed so important that they had to be preserved? Had he somehow known what was coming? The call from Rossi came on a Tuesday afternoon. Her voice was different this time, stripped of its professional detachment. It was tight, charged with an energy that sent a shiver down Leo's spine. "We got the images back," she said. "The lab was able to develop 34 of the 36 exposures. You need to come in." The lab technicians had worked a small miracle. The images were clear, the colors still vibrant, a testament to the quality of the film and the absolute darkness of the canister. Detective Rossi laid the glossy 8x10 prints out on a large table in a sterile evidence room. Leo stood beside her, his hands trembling as he looked down at the last moments of his brother's life, frozen in time. The first 31 photographs were breathtaking. They were exactly the kind of work Ethan had dedicated his life to creating. There were majestic, wide-angle shots of valleys filled with morning mist, the autumn leaves a riot of red and gold. There were intimate, detailed studies of moss on a rock, of light filtering through a canopy of leaves, of the intricate patterns of bark on an ancient tree. Each image was perfectly composed, a masterclass in light and shadow. They were beautiful and heartbreaking, a gallery of a world his brother had loved, captured just before he was taken from it. "He was an artist," Rossi said softly, her eyes on the photos. Leo could only nod, a lump forming in his throat. These images were a ghost, a vibrant, living echo of his brother's vision. But then they came to the final 3 prints. The shift was jarring, violent. The artistry was gone, replaced by something raw and chaotic. The 32nd photo was a blur of motion, a chaotic swirl of green and brown, as if the camera had been dropped or swung wildly. It was an image of pure panic. The 33rd exposure was darker, taken from a low angle. It showed the ground, a tangle of roots and dark, wet soil. In the upper corner, a scuffed boot was visible. Leo recognized the boot. It was the same brand Ethan had worn. The camera was on the ground, pointing up. The final photograph, the last image Ethan Hayes ever took, made the air in the room turn cold. It was out of focus, taken in near darkness, the grain of the high-speed film as thick as sand. It depicted the interior of a space, a small, enclosed area. The walls were made of rough, unhewn logs, chinked with mud. There was no window visible, only the faint, diffuse light from an unseen source. In the center of the frame, occupying most of the space, was a human face. It was the face of a man, gaunt and pale, with a long, matted beard and eyes that were two dark pits of shadow. The face was distorted, blurred by the slow shutter speed and the lack of light, but the menace in it was perfectly clear. He was looking down directly into the lens. It was a portrait of a nightmare. Leo stared at the face, his blood running cold. This was not an accident. This was not a bear. This was a monster. This was the man who had taken his brother. Detective Rossi pointed to a detail in the background, something barely visible behind the man's shoulder. It was a symbol, crudely carved into one of the logs on the wall. It was a circle with a single, jagged line drawn through it, like a stylized lightning bolt or a broken branch. "We've never seen this before," Rossi said, her voice grim. "It's not a known trail marker or a historical symbol from this area." The photograph was a message from the grave. Ethan, in his final moments, had managed to do the one thing he was born to do. He had captured the truth. He had photographed his killer. The quiet, sterile evidence room now felt like the center of a storm. The 11 years of silence had been shattered by the click of a shutter. The case of the missing hiker was now a homicide investigation. The ghost Leo had been chasing for a decade now had a face, and the hunt for him began at that moment. The discovery of the photograph transformed the investigation. The blurry, haunting image of the bearded man became the sole focus. The original case file was irrelevant. This was a new hunt, a search for a phantom who had lived, perhaps for decades, unseen in the deep wilderness. Detective Rossi assembled a small, dedicated task force. Their first step was to try and identify the man in the photo. The image was sent to state and federal databases, run through facial recognition software, but the quality was too poor. The distortion and shadows yielded no matches. The face remained anonymous, a ghost in the grain. Their only other clue was the strange symbol carved on the cabin wall. Rossi had her team scour historical archives, books on local folklore, and databases of gang and extremist symbols. Nothing. The symbols seemed to be unique, a private language. Rossi believed the key was not in a database, but in the collective memory of the region. She and her team, accompanied by a reluctant but determined Leo Hayes, began a slow, methodical process of interviewing people who had a long history with the park. They spoke to retired rangers, elderly hunters, local historians, and members of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians whose ancestral lands included the park. They carried a high-quality print of the final photograph, keeping the face concealed and showing only the symbol. For weeks, they met with blank stares and shrugs. The symbol meant nothing to anyone. The stories they heard were plentiful, tales of strange lights in the woods, of other hikers who had vanished without a trace over the years, but they were just stories, fragments of folklore with no evidence to back them up. The task force began to feel a familiar sense of cold case despair creeping in. But then, a retired ranger named Sullivan, a man in his late 80s with a memory as sharp as a newly honed axe, recognized the symbol. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew where he had seen it before. "It was a long time ago," he told Rossi, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Back in the 70s, there was a family, lived way up in the hills on private land that bordered the park. They were different, kept to themselves, didn't like outsiders." Sullivan explained that the family, the Cades, had been on that land for generations, since before the park was even established. They viewed the park and its visitors as an intrusion. He recalled an incident where a park survey team had accidentally strayed onto their property and had been met by the family patriarch, a stern, silent man carrying a rifle who had escorted them off without a word. Sullivan had been a young ranger then, sent to smooth things over. He remembered seeing that same symbol, the circle with the broken line, carved into the gatepost of their property. "The old man said it was their mark," Sullivan recalled. "It meant this land is ours, and it is broken from your world." The lead was electrifying. Rossi's team immediately dove into property records. They found the land Sullivan had described, a large isolated tract on the park's northern border. The record showed it was still owned by the Cade family, though the property taxes had gone unpaid for the last 5 years. There was no official record of anyone living there for decades. The family had seemingly vanished from the modern world. The next step was to find the property itself. It was not accessible by any road. Using old survey maps and satellite imagery, they pinpointed the location of a dilapidated structure that could be the family homestead. It was situated in a deep, narrow valley surrounded by some of the most rugged terrain in the entire mountain range. Getting there would require a multi-day expedition on foot. A sense of dread and anticipation hung over the team as they prepared. They were not just looking for a cabin, they were stepping back in time, into a forgotten world governed by its own rules. Leo insisted on going with them. Rossi was hesitant, but she saw the look in his eyes. He had been on this journey for 11 years. He had to see it through to the end. The team that set out was a mix of sheriff's deputies and experienced park rangers, all trained in backcountry operations. They were armed and equipped for a potentially hostile encounter. As they hiked deeper into the wilderness, the landscape grew more imposing. The trees were older, the forest darker. They found signs that they were on the right path, old faded blaze marks on trees that matched no known trail system. And then they found the symbols. The first one was carved into a large stone at a creek crossing. The second was on the trunk of a massive oak. They were markers, territorial warnings. The team moved with a heightened sense of caution, their senses on high alert. They felt like intruders, and they had the unsettling feeling that they were being watched. On the morning of the third day, they crested a ridge and looked down into the valley below. There it was, a small, dilapidated cabin, its roof sagging, a thin plume of smoke curling from its stone chimney. It was a scene from another century. The cabin in the valley was a relic, a thing of rough-hewn logs and sagging porches that seemed to be slowly sinking back into the earth. But the smoke from the chimney was a clear sign of life. As Detective Rossi's team began their slow, tactical approach from the ridgeline, they saw a figure emerge from the cabin. It was a man, tall and shockingly thin, with a wild, graying beard that reached his chest. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, chopping firewood with a practiced rhythm. Even from a distance, Leo knew it was him. The face from the photograph, now 11 years older, etched with the solitude and harshness of the mountains. The team moved into position surrounding the small homestead. Rossi's voice, amplified by a bullhorn, cut through the quiet valley. "This is the sheriff's department. Come out with your hands in the air." The man, who they would soon learn was Silas Cade, did not flinch. He slowly lowered his axe, turned, and stared up at the woods where the voice had come from. He showed no fear, no surprise, only a kind of weary resignation. He raised his hands and walked slowly toward them. The confrontation was eerily calm. Silas Cade was compliant, almost docile. He spoke in a soft, quiet voice, his accent thick with the archaic inflections of the mountains. He seemed uncomprehending of the badges and the guns, as if these symbols of authority had no meaning in his world. When Rossi showed him the photograph taken by Ethan, he simply nodded. "He was a trespasser," Silas said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The mountain has rules." The interior of the cabin was exactly as it had appeared in the photograph. It was a single, dark room, lit by a kerosene lamp. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and something else, something old and sad. On the far wall, carved into the logs, was the symbol, and in a dusty corner, leaning against the wall, was a vintage Leica M3 camera. Leo saw it and felt the air leave his lungs. It was Ethan's. He moved toward it, his legs unsteady, and picked it up. It felt cold and heavy in his hands, a sacred object that had borne silent witness to a tragedy. Rossi's team conducted a careful search of the property. Behind the cabin, they found a small, overgrown vegetable garden and a series of unmarked graves in a small clearing, marked only by simple fieldstones. Silas Cade, in his quiet, detached manner, began to tell his story. He was the last of his family. He had been born in this cabin, and he had never left the valley. His father and his grandfather had taught him the family's code, to protect the land, to live apart from the world, and to deal with trespassers in their own way. He spoke of Ethan Hayes not as a murder victim, but as a visitor who wouldn't leave. He said Ethan had stumbled upon the valley, fascinated by the old cabin. Silas had initially been wary, then hostile. He had trapped Ethan, holding him captive in a small, windowless root cellar beneath the cabin. "You made too much noise," Silas said, referring to the click of the camera's shutter, always trying to steal the light. The story of Ethan's final moments came out in fragmented, chilling detail. After several days of captivity, Ethan had feigned illness. When Silas opened the root cellar door to bring him water, Ethan had made a desperate move. He hadn't tried to run. He had raised his camera, which Silas had inexplicably allowed him to keep, and fired the shutter, the flashball momentarily blinding the reclusive man. It was an act of defiance, an artist's final, desperate attempt to document the truth. Enraged by this theft of his shadow, as he called it, Silas had killed him. He led the detectives to one of the unmarked graves and pointed. "He's here," he said. "He's part of the mountain now." The excavation confirmed his story. The remains of Ethan Hayes were found, buried in the cold, dark earth of the valley. The long search was finally over. The trial of Silas Cade was a strange affair. He seemed disconnected from the proceedings, a man from another time forced into a world he didn't understand. His court-appointed lawyer argued for diminished capacity, painting him as a victim of a profoundly isolated and delusional upbringing. But the jury found him guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, a sterile, ordered world that would be the ultimate cage for a man who had only ever known the wild. For Leo Hayes, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but not peace. He had found his brother, and he had found the truth. But the 11 years of not knowing had carved something out of him that could never be replaced. He took possession of Ethan's camera. The lab confirmed it was the same one that had taken the final, damning photograph. The roll of film inside was, of course, finished. There were no more images to be found. Leo returned to his cabin near the park, but he no longer hiked the trails. His war with the mountains was over. Sometimes he would take the Leica out of its case and hold it, the cold metal a connection to the brother he had lost. He never put another roll of film in it. He knew that some stories have only one ending, and the last picture had already been taken. The mountains, in their vast, ancient silence, seemed to agree. The colors of autumn still returned each year, a brilliant, beautiful spectacle. But for Leo, they would forever be tinged with the memory of a shadow hidden in the heart of the wilderness, and the quiet click of a shutter that had finally, after a long and painful decade, brought the truth into the light. The aftermath of Silas Cade's trial rippled through the communities bordering the national park. The story of the Mountain Man murder, as the media dubbed it, became a modern legend. A chilling tale told to tourists and a somber reminder to locals of the secrets the wilderness could hold. The Cade Valley was declared a crime scene and sealed off, a place on the map that was now synonymous with a dark and disturbing history. For Detective Rossi, the case was a career-defining moment, but it left her with a profound sense of unease. She had unraveled the mystery, but she was haunted by the other unmarked graves found on Silas's property. Forensic teams were still working to identify the remains, but it was a slow, painstaking process. It became clear that Ethan Hayes was not Silas Cade's only victim. He was just the one who had managed to leave a clue behind. Rossi often thought about the sheer improbable luck of it all. The waterproof canister, the preserved film, the one-in-a-million discovery by the geology team. Without Ethan's final, desperate act of photography, Silas Cade would have remained a ghost, and the other bodies would have continued their silent decomposition in the unmarked graves, their stories lost forever. The case forced a re-examination of other missing person files connected to the park, cold cases that spanned decades. Investigators now looked at them through a new lens, wondering if any of these lost hikers had also been trespassers who had stumbled into Silas Cade's world. It was a chilling thought that a predator had operated for so long, protected by the sheer vastness of the wilderness and a philosophy of isolation so profound, it was almost invisible to the modern world. Leo Hayes found himself an unwilling celebrity, a symbol of brotherly devotion and relentless hope. He was inundated with requests for interviews, for book deals, for movie rights. He turned them all down. He had not pursued the truth for fame or fortune. He had done it for Ethan. His only public act was to help establish a foundation in Ethan's name, an organization that provided funding and support for long-term missing person cases. helping other families who were trapped in the same agonizing limbo that he had endured for over a decade. He understood now that the most painful part of loss was not the grief, but the uncertainty. The not knowing was a special kind of hell, a wound that could never heal because it was constantly being picked open by the hope of a different answer. He finally sold his cabin near the mountains. He could no longer find peace there. The beauty of the landscape was now permanently intertwined with the horror of what it had concealed. He moved to the coast, to a place of wide open skies and a horizon that was not broken by jagged peaks. He took Ethan's photographs with him, the beautiful ones from the beginning of the roll. He had them professionally framed and hung them in his new home. They were a reminder of the artist his brother had been, of the light he had seen in the world before the darkness found him. He kept the last photograph, the blurry face of Silas Cade, locked away in a safe deposit box. It was a piece of evidence, a historical document, but it was not something he ever needed to see again. The image was already burned into his memory, a permanent scar. The Leica camera sat on his mantelpiece, a silent, beautiful machine. It was both a memorial and a symbol. It represented Ethan's passion and his ultimate undoing, but it also represented his triumph. In the end, it was not a gun or a knife that had brought a killer to justice. It was a camera. It was a single, captured moment of light and shadow, an image that had outlasted the darkness, a quiet testament to the fact that even in the deepest, most silent wilderness, the truth can find a way to expose itself to the light. The story of Ethan Hayes became a permanent part of the park's narrative, a cautionary tale that rangers told to new hikers. It spoke of the dangers of the wilderness, not just the cliffs and the animals, but the unpredictable nature of the people who sought to lose themselves in it. The Cade Valley was eventually reclaimed by the forest, the cabins slowly collapsing under the weight of snow and time, the unmarked graves becoming indistinguishable from the forest floor. The mountain was taking back its own, erasing the scars of a human tragedy. But the story lived on, a reminder that some places hold their secrets tighter than others, and that sometimes the only thing that can bring them to light is the unwavering focus of a lens held by a man who, even in his last moments, refused to let the darkness win.